Welcome back to our deep dive series into the MPEP, the Manual of Patent Examining Procedure.
Yep, we're continuing our journey section by section, trying to make this dense material a bit more accessible.
And today we're landing in Chapter 2100, which is all about patentability, specifically Section 2187.
Ah, yes, 2187. This one's about the form paragraphs examiners use for functional claiming under 35 U.S.C. 112F.
Exactly. The full title is Form Paragraphs for Use Relating to 35 U.S.C. 112, or Pre-AIA 35 U.S.C. 112, sixth paragraph. Sounds a bit technical, but it's really practical stuff.
It really is. It dictates how examiners communicate about, those means for or step for type claims. Super important for understanding office actions.
It definitely is. Before we get into the weeds, though, we really want to give a big thank you to Mike Shepard.
Absolutely. Mike's the creative director behind this whole MPEP project, and honestly, his vision is what's making this series happen. So thank you, Mike.
Seriously. Thank you, Mike. Couldn't do it without you.
Right.
Let's dive into 2187. What's the core concept here? So let's start with the statute itself, 35 U.S.C. 112F. What's the fundamental idea behind it?
Well, the basic idea is it lets you claim an invention element by describing what it does its function instead of having to spell out its exact structure or materials right there in the claim.
Okay, so it's a functional description.
Right. Think like instead of describing every gear and lever, you might say something like means for fastening.
Ah, okay. And the statute mentions specific phrases that usually trigger this, like means for or step for.
Exactly. Those are the classic flags. You use those phrases and you don't recite the specific structure or acts that perform the function in the claim itself. That's the crucial part. You leave the how to the specification.
Right. So if I use means for doing X and don't describe the means structure in the claim, what happens? How does the examiner interpret that claim element?
That's where 112F kicks in formally. It mandates that the examiner interprets that limitation to cover only the corresponding structure, material, or acts that you did describe in your specification, plus their equivalents.
Okay, hold on. So the scope isn't just the functional words in the claim anymore. It gets tied directly back to what I actually showed in my drawings and description.
Precisely. It essentially says, you claimed it functionally. Fine. But the scope of that function is limited to the structures you actually disclose to perform it. It makes your specification incredibly important for defining the boundaries of those functional claims.
Wow, okay. That really shifts the focus, doesn't it? Specification becomes key. So the spec is critical. But how does the examiner even decide in the first place if 112F applies to a specific claim element? There's a test, right? The source mentions a three-pronged test from MPE 2181.
That's right. Examiners follow this specific three-step analysis. Prong 1. Does the claim use the word means, step, or, importantly, some other generic placeholder?
Generic placeholder? Like what?
Well, words like mechanism, module, device, unit, component, words that by themselves don't really suggest a specific structure to someone skilled in the art.
Okay, so a non-structural term. Got it. What's prong 2?
Prong 2 is that generic term modified by functional language. Does the claim state what the thing does, like means for attaching or module for processing?
A generic term plus its function. Makes sense. And the third prong?
The third prong is key. Does the claim itself fail to recite sufficient structure, material, or acts for performing that function? If you say a means for attaching, but then in the same claim you describe the specific bolts and brackets that do the attaching, then prong 3 might not be met.
I see. So if you have the generic term, the function, and no structure in the claim, then what?
Then there's a presumption, a rebuttable presumption, but still a strong starting point that the limitation falls under 112F.
And its scope will be limited to the spec disclosure.
Exactly. Understanding this test is crucial because it's the flowchart the examiner uses to potentially narrow your claim scope based on your specification.
Let's make this really concrete. The source material uses a door example. Can you walk us through that?
Sure. Let's say a claim recites a mechanism for securing a door. We apply a test. Prong 1. Mechanism. Is that generic? Yeah, usually pretty generic. Doesn't scream specific structure.
Okay.
Prong 2, for securing a door. Functional. Clearly. It says what it does.
Right.
Prong 3. Does the claim describe the structure of the mechanism? If it just stops there, a mechanism for securing a door, then no, it doesn't recite structure.
So check, check, check. All three prongs met.
Right. So the examiner presumes 112 applies. The scope of mechanism for securing a door is limited to whatever specific mechanisms, maybe a specific type of lock or bar you actually showed in your patent application's description and drawings.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, what about the other example? A latch for securing a door. How does that change things?
Big change, potentially. Let's run the test again. Prong 1, is that generic? Probably not.
Yeah.
Because someone skilled in the art usually understands latch to mean a certain type of structure. It implies, a catch, a bolt, something physical that engages. It has some inherent structural connotation.
Ah. So even though prong 2 for securing a door is still functional.
Exactly. The word latch itself might provide enough structural character to fail prong 1, or maybe even prong 3, depending on context. It could potentially rebut the presumption that 112 should apply.
Wow. So changing mechanism to latch could mean the difference between being limited to your drawings versus getting a potentially broader interpretation based on the general meaning of latch.
That's the power and the potential pitfall of word choice and functional claiming. It can have a huge impact on scope based on this test.
That really drives home the importance of careful drafting. And this is where Section 2187 itself comes in, right? With the form paragraphs. How do these fit into the picture?
Right. Section 2187 is basically the examiner's playbook for communicating their findings about 112. It gives them standardized text blocks, these form paragraphs, to insert into office actions.
So instead of writing it out fresh each time, they use these pre-approved statements.
Pretty much. It ensures consistency and clearly states the legal basis. For example, if the examiner does conclude that a claim element falls under a 112F, they might use paragraph 7.3.03 or 3.0.055.
And what do those paragraphs say, generally?
They'll typically state that the limitation is being interpreted under 35 U.S.C. 112, that it meets the criteria, maybe referencing the three-prong test, implicitly and crucially, that its interpretation is limited to the corresponding structure, material, or acts disclosed in the specification.
So seeing one of those paragraph numbers in an office action is like a direct signal. We're applying 112F here, look to your spec.
Exactly. It's code in a way. And there are other paragraphs for different situations too, like 7.30.06 might be used if a 112F applies even without the word means, because the term used was generic enough. And 7.3.07 could be for the opposite case where means was used, but the applicant actually did include enough structure in the claim to rebut the presumption, so 112F doesn't apply. These paragraphs cover the nuances.
Okay, so paragraphs for saying how they're interpreting it. What about rejections? Can this 112F interpretation lead to a rejection?
Oh, absolutely. The most direct link is to rejections under 35 U.S.C. 112B, which is the requirement for definiteness.
How does that happen?
Well, remember, if 112F applies, the scope is defined by the corresponding structure in the specification. So the examiner applies 112F, looks back at the spec, and what if there's no structure described for that function? Or it's super vague.
Ah, so the claim says means for doing X, but the spec doesn't actually show how to do X.
Exactly. If there's no corresponding structure or it's not clearly linked to the function, then the scope of that claim element can't be determined. It's indefinite. And Section 2187 provides form paragraphs for that situation too. Paragraph 7.34.23 is a common one. That's used when the examiner concludes that the specification fails to disclose adequate corresponding structure, material, or acts for the claimed function. Basically, you invoked 112, but your spec doesn't hold up its end of the bargain.
Okay, so that's a failure of disclosure. What about 7.34.24?
That one's a bit different. It's used when the claim language itself is so ambiguous, the examiner can't even reliably determine whether 112F should apply or not. The wording is just too unclear to run the test properly, leading to an indefiniteness rejection based on the claim language itself.
Got it. So these paragraphs pinpoint the exact reason for the 112B rejection in the context of functional claiming. Okay, let's pull back a bit. Why is understanding this particular section 2187 and these specific paragraphs so important for someone dealing with patents?
Because it demystifies a really critical part of patent examination. Functional claiming is powerful, but it comes with these specific rules of interpretation under 112F. Section 2187 tells you how the examiner will apply those rules and how they will communicate their conclusions to you.
It's about clarity and predictability then.
Absolutely. Instead of getting an office action and wondering, why are they interpreting my means for claim this way? Or why is this indefinite? Seeing those specific form paragraph numbers, the 7.3.03, 7.34.23, etc., gives you an immediate, precise understanding of the examiner's reasoning and the legal basis they're using.
So for drafters, knowing the three-prong test and the impact of words like mechanism versus latch is vital before filing.
Definitely. You can draft strategically to either invoke 112F intentionally with strong spec support or avoid it.
And for prosecutors, recognizing these paragraphs helps you craft much more targeted responses, right?
Yeah.
You know exactly what issue to address.
Exactly. It saves time and focuses the arguments. Understanding 2187 and its form paragraphs is just a really practical piece of navigating the whole process effectively.
So we've really unpacked MPP Section 2187 today. We looked at how examiners handle functional claim limitations under 35 U.S.C. 112F.
Yeah, we covered the three-pronged test they use to decide if a 112F even applies, saw how critical word choices with that latch versus mechanism example.
Right, and then we dug into the actual form paragraphs. Examiners use the specific language they deploy to tell you how they're interpreting your claim or why they might be rejecting it under 112B for indefiniteness.
Knowing those paragraphs like 7.3.03 or 7.34.23 really gives you insight into the examiner's perspective.
It absolutely does. It equips you to better understand and respond to office actions.
Which brings us to a really interesting final thought.
Okay.
We've talked about how knowing these form paragraphs helps you respond to the examiner. But think about this. If you know in advance the precise language and logic, the examiner is likely to use the exact wording of 7.34.23 if your spec support is weak. For instance, how might that detailed knowledge change how you approach drafting your claims and, maybe even more importantly, your specification right from the very beginning?
That's taking it a step further. Not just reacting, but proactively drafting around or towards those specific paragraph scenarios from day one.
Exactly. Could you structure your disclosure and claims to deliberately avoid triggering a specific rejection paragraph or to perfectly align with an interpretation paragraph?
Something to definitely chew on, that proactive strategy.
It's a deeper level of strategy for sure. Keep that in mind as you continue navigating the MPP.
And join us next time for another deep dive.
This summary of the MPEP was generated using AI tools, including ChatGPT and NotebookLM, and may contain errors or omissions. It is provided for general educational and informational purposes only, and is not legal advice or a substitute for formal instruction. For authoritative guidance, consult the official MPEP, a qualified instructor, or a registered patent practitioner.